This lecture is titled The Right to Write, and the activist tool is the petition. We're going to learn about the special relationship that women and I think disempowered people overall have to this tool, the petition. Now, a petition is really a personal appeal or a request for a favor from a governing official or someone else in power. And it's a tool available for those who lack other avenues. Okay, so people who can't vote or who are not important constituents of the official that they're affected by. Anyone who wouldn't be able to go through regular channels. So a petition is really for when the normal channels fail. And it's used by non-citizens often to assert the ruler's responsibility to them. So for example, when slavery was abolished in the North, so that's the colony's independence from England, Belinda petitioned the Massachusetts state legislature for reparations for slavery. That was a personal appeal based on, even though she wasn't fully a citizen, based on a sort of greater moral responsibility that she felt the ruling elite had to her. Similarly, but she was not successful. But the freed women in Rio de Janeiro and Havana were more successful. Rio de Janeiro and Havana were two of the last places in the Americas to abolish slavery. So we're talking a century later in the late 1800s. And the philosophy was for them to slowly free the slaves. But women who were freed then turned their political energies to petitioning for the freedom of their slaved relatives. Now, they had a personal motivation, right? It was personal for them. It was about their own families. But it ended up having this political effect of speeding the end of slavery once the legislatures got so many of these petitions. So it's interesting. One of the things about the petition is this sort of gray area between, is it political or is it personal? And remember, as feminists, we say the personal is political. And right in that space, I think, gave women a good entry into politics in the early republic. And so not a lot of people realize women's important role in abolitionist politics. And so between 1833 and 1845, women sent 8,500 anti-slavery petitions to Congress. And of course, women couldn't vote at the time, right? Women didn't gain the right to vote until 1920. But this provoked intense debate about whether women had the right to petition Congress. And Congress actually spent hours and hours debating whether they had to read these letters or not. And some of the question was, are women citizens? Do we need to be responsible to women even though they can't vote? And women knew this. And so when they wrote these petitions, they would appeal to sort of their moral authority as mothers, right? Asserting that slavery was wrong, and kind of positioning themselves as women who have this special relationship to morality. And then also they would use religious values. One of the interesting things is that the women's rights movement actually grew out of abolition. And the best canvassers became effective women's rights advocates. Now, there's two parts to every petition, right? The one is writing it, and then there's canvassing, which is getting as many signatures as you possibly can. And I read that in this time period, women were actually got 50% more signatures than male canvassers in the abolition movement, which I thought was pretty amazing. And then those women who were the most successful turned out to be effective women's rights activists. Now, women's rights, as I said, really grew out of abolition, partly because as women were making these arguments for abolition, they started to have to argue for themselves also, for their right to be listened to, for their right to even speak on the subject, right? The attitude was sort of like, well, you're women, you don't vote, so why should we listen to you? And so that started to incentivize women to begin their own movement. And in fact, in the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who were famous US women's rights activists, that was where they got their start, because when they arrived at the Anti-Slavery Convention, they were told that they couldn't be seated in the General Assembly, and that they would have to observe from the ladies' balcony and not be allowed to speak or vote. And so they used this time to plot their revenge, for lack of a better word, and they said women really need their own movement. And I would be remiss if I told you that all women's petitions led to this kind of political activism for women's rights, because there were also women petitioners who really felt like they weren't reformers, and particularly those who were involved in Native Americans' rights around the same time. In 1830, Congress proposed the Indian Removal Act, which ended up passing and removing Native Americans living in the South out to points further west. The biggest opponents of the policy were actually the Christian missionaries who were attempting to Christianize Native Americans in the South. And now, I will say that I think that has a lot of problems, right? That you are attempting to force Christianity on people when they have their own cultural practices and their own religious and spiritual practices. At the same time, these were the most vocal advocates against the Indian Removal Act. And between 1830 and 1831, 1,400 women petitioned Congress. And they phrased it as, the 61 ladies of Hallowell, Maine, or the 63 ladies of Steubenville, Ohio. And they were very clear that these were private moral appeals based on benevolence, okay, and based on the fact that they were Christians and that this was what was morally right, and that they were not in any way reformers. They wanted to dissociate themselves from politics because women's place was not in politics at the time. And that included Catherine Beecher, who actually started her political career around this time, who was a very prominent women's education activist, but also anti-suffrage. And, we forget a lot of times when the first wave of the women's movement in the United States is taught, it's taught as if it's almost exclusively about women getting the vote in 1920. But actually, in earlier periods, education, abolition, women's property rights, all of these things were very important and linked causes. And then I think once slavery was abolished and women actually did not get the right to vote, a lot of people thought that at the end of the Civil War, women would be rewarded with the right to vote, and that didn't happen. At that point, the women's rights movement sort of split into factions, which, for lack of a better word, a sort of very racist segment that didn't allow African American women into their parades, asked them to march in the back of their parades or not at all, and a sort of, I would say, less racist version that continued to work with the civil rights movement as it emerged. And I think we hear civil rights movement and we think 1960s, but actually you could trace the beginning of the civil rights movement to probably before this, but 1909 was an important year for the civil rights movement. That was when activists issued the call. And the call was the call for a civil rights movement. 1909 was again a very strong activist time, right? We learned before about what was going on in the labor movement at the time. It's also it's also, 11 years before women will get the right to vote. So these things are all happening at the same time. Now, education reform was actually very successful very early. And so when you move to 1909, now all of a sudden you're in a very different society where where much more people can read, where there's much higher rates of literacy among all Americans, but particularly among African Americans as compared to 1830, when it was illegal for African Americans to learn how to read. And so the call was emerging at a very different time, and it is a petition, but it's almost an open letter at the same time. And they were smart, right? They used mainstream media to get the word out. So it was actually authored, although the idea came from activists. The author of the petition was Oswald Garrison Villard, who was the president of the New York Evening Post Company. Very powerful, able to put out the call to all the magazines that he edited, all the magazines and newspapers that he edited. And in it, he argued for a national civil rights organization for African Americans, and this was the genesis of the NAACP, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. They identified two key issues, which were voting rights and lynching. Okay, lynching is extra legal, meaning outside of the law, mob vigilante violence against African Americans who are alleged to have committed a crime, but frequently African American business owners who threatened white businesses were targeted. And this worked, and this is one of the examples of how important, once again, linking their variety of social movements can be, because it was signed by 19 other women social workers, educators, and activists, and they used the existing frameworks of the settlement movement, of women's rights, of education reform to get publicity and signatures. And two of the original signatures were from Mary Church Terrell, who was one of the founders of the Black Women's Club movement. The Black Women's Club movement existed in parallel to the white women's suffrage movement, and they were for suffrage, but it was also about, I would say, a collection of more middle-class African Americans attempting to uplift everyone else in their race, trying to use their privilege for education, to increase education and resources. Ida B. Wells Barnett was a little bit more radical. She was at one point, she was an anti-lynching activist, owned her own newspaper. At one point, she was asked to march at the back of a women's suffrage parade, and at the last moment, she ran right to the front and marched in the front. So a pretty awesome lady. And now we have this emergence where it's not just appealing to Congress based on personal. These women were able to use their networks and use the press to build a national movement that was going to argue, that was going to be counter to, that was going to enhance what they saw as very slow change of pace in government. And now I want to take a minute and bring us 100 more years in the future to the present, or over 100 more years in the future to the present day, to show you how easy it is today. If you want to start a petition, you simply have to go to change.org and you can start a petition here or here. And it allows you to, it's just an easy platform that allows you to circulate via digital media, right? So you could circulate your petition and hashtag it, or email it to your friends or anything. But I would say keep in mind, if you do want to do a petition, the value of face-to-face interaction. I still think that you could get more signatures face-to-face with people. So both is a great option. I will see you on the discussion boards, and keep in mind all these things about petitions because we're going to be moving